Hi booktube, Aaron here, hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be doing a bit of a reading update, going through a few books that I've finished since the beginning of the month. Two of the books are audiobooks, which I don't often talk about, or I sometimes forget to mention because they're not physical books, they're not on my Kindle or anything like that, so I can't hold it up and show you. Like often if I haven't read a book on my Kindle for a while, but often if I read a book on the Kindle, I at least bring the Kindle along and put it on the pile of books in front of me to remind me that I read a book on my Kindle and I can show you. Because I think in a very kind of analog way, if I can't feel something with my hands, it may as well not be there, which is sort of why I think I often forget to respond to texts. But anyway, so I often forget to mention audiobooks, and so I'm going to try and remedy that with two audiobooks that I finished early this month, and one physical book. They're all non-fiction. I've got one work of history, and then two of them are, broadly speaking, essay collections, and are both people skirting around a kind of theme, I suppose, and books that are people just trying to work things out. So the first book, the history book that I finished, I've been working on for a while, and that was Diarmaid MacCulloch's The History of Christianity, the first 3,000 years. And he calls it the first 3,000 years because he goes back 1,000 years more than you'd expect to initially to ancient Greece, because a lot of that is going to become very important, and particularly with the New Testament, some sort of Platonic ideas and things like that are going to be quite important. I think in particularly maybe in the Gospel of John and in some of the epistles of Paul and things like that. But then also in medieval European interpretations of Christianity, Aristotle is going to be very important. And so, yeah, he starts off with the ancient Greeks, and then you get, since both the Old and New Testament are the foundational texts that Christianity has as its holy book, you then get a kind of retelling of the whole Bible as well, and of Judaism, and you sort of get a sort of picture of how Judaism sort of changes and things like that as well, from time to time. And then later on, you get a picture of Islam as well, because Islam is, as sort of branching off. You could see it as branching off from Christianity if you want to, but it's certainly very related to Christianity, and is engaging with things that had both been discussed in both Christianity and Judaism. It's a kind of crazy whistle-stop tour, I suppose. It's a massive book, but my overall impression was that it wasn't long enough, because he's dealing with Christianity from all over the world, because from very early on it spread relatively wide, and so there's been, probably one of the oldest churches in the world is the Ethiopian church, and then there's all kinds of ways that Christianity spread eastwards as well as westwards, and there's very much an Eastern tradition, by which I don't mean sort of Greek Orthodox or something, but over into Syria and as far as China, so there's all kinds of things like that are fascinating to read about. And because he's doing this, because he's jumping from place to place, and maybe he wants to talk about how Christianity spreads eastwards, and then we look at maybe how it spreads westwards into Europe, and we get more of the story that maybe, well, definitely I as a European would be more familiar with, and then maybe we'll look at Byzantium and then the rise of Russia and all those things. It's constantly jumping around backwards and forwards in time, and sometimes you may get intimations of certain maybe theological controversies from one side, and then you go back in time to a different location, sort of move through whatever he wants to talk about, and then you get the other side of that controversy. And I wish, there's part of me that wishes it could just be dealt with in one place at one time, a little more, in a little more depth. So like with the Reformation and like with Luther, it's kind of hinted at, kind of discussed, without even getting to the Reformation initially. I got to a point where I was like, well, is he even going to mention Luther? Is he going to actually spend any time with Luther? Because he's already kind of talked about him from like a second or third degree when talking about these other areas and other traditions. And then eventually he does. And the Reformation itself still feels like a very kind of whistle-stop tour that and it's just kind of my feeling was that I just wish he would stay in one period for a little bit longer, and just really dig into what they were thinking and what was going on a little bit more. And I kind of feel like he failed to do that a little bit. So that was my, but then it would have been a massive 3-volume book that runs, it would be like In Search of Lost Time or something. So I can see why it didn't get to that length, but I just couldn't help but feel that he needed to slow down a little bit. But maybe that's just me. And then moving on, again, skirting around this sort of Christian theme, I read this book by Christian Wiman. It's called Zero at the Bone, 50 Entries Against Despair. And it's him just working things out. It's a mishmash of all kinds of things, of sort of more diaristic sections, sections that feel like sort of memoir. There's some of his own poetry in there. There are sections that are kind of essays on specific poets and specific poems. There are sections in there that are sort of like a commonplace book where he's selected all of these quotations, and is sort of drawing out a theme from all of them, which I love. I really love stuff like that. And there's even one section where it's a kind of a dialogue with the self, which was brilliant, and it was this kind of self rebuttal as he made his way through it. I wonder if I can find it. Probably not. But it's just this sort of questioning of what it is he's doing at all, and why he's doing this. He keeps on sort of contradicting himself and wondering whether he's doing things for the right reasons. But yeah, he's sort of obsessed with this connection between faith and suffering. I think that's sort of underlying the whole thing. He's looking at his family, he's looking at poetry, he's looking at God and his own experiences. But yeah, kind of teasing out this idea of suffering, and how faith is connected to it, maybe. But it's also it's just kind of about what poetry is for, I think. And part of what I really love about this book is the way in which it's a kind of a massive bag full of loads of great recommendations. And there's a poet in here that he spends a whole section talking about, and he's called, let's have a look. He's called William Bronk, and he starts off the section saying this: sometimes it seems there's nothing left to read. Nothing new, I mean. In English, I mean, which is the only language I read well enough to read with my ear, that is to say, with my soul. Of course, I come across striking individual poems here and there, and of course the old favourites remain mercurial and volatile, and always have some new shadow to enlighten me. But I long for that bracing, immersive shock of style, the infiltration of an entire consciousness that both unsettles and restores my own, rather than the detached admiration of some singular aspect. I am 53 years old, and have somehow never before read, or more accurately, never properly heard, William Bronk. And then he goes on to share a few William Bronk poems and talk about them. And I'll read one of these that just stood out to me, called The Reign of Small Occurrences, which I really quite liked. The Reign of Small Occurrences. So many things happen, many smaller than a sparrow's fall. It is a long rain in rain country, where the flow falls steadily all day and all night long, and the next day keeps on falling in air, in an air, half water, and a world half gone to dissolution, fluid and almost formless in the rain of small occurrences. So many things happen at a single time. It seems an idleness to note them all, or try to note them all. For who could note them, smaller than a sparrow's fall? And so again, is just sort of just in there in that poem, you can kind of see how it might connect to that central idea of faith and suffering. That idea of the sparrow's fall from one of Jesus's parables. Maybe not even a parable, just some of his sayings. Sort of about how, God even notices the sparrows falling. But then this poem is, but so many things are happening, so many sparrows are falling. How can, the mind boggles just thinking of how much is going on, and potentially from that how much pain is going on, and stuff like that. And there's a kind of coldness but also a sense of humour to William Bronk, and he's a poet that I really want to try and seek out. He's not that well known, I don't think, but we'll see. But I really quite enjoyed some of the conclusions he comes to. Let's try and read this bit. It's one of his reflections on the poetry. He says, "For a long time I thought the loneliness of poetry was terrible, in both senses of that word. It was a grief that every poet suffered in order to be the voice that being, capital B, needed to acquire. And it was also a source of spiritual power. Now I see that loneliness is general. Poetry merely gives form to this fact and makes it available, and therefore bearable." And so yeah, it's just those kind of little reflections that I think are the kind of life of the book for me, and the idea there of how poetry might be. I mean, he sort of thinks of God through poetry, thinks of God as a kind of poem, or tries to understand God, how he might understand a poem. I can't quite sort of work out what he's talking about there, or I can't quite sort of relay it to you. But yeah, a fascinating book, and it just feels nice just to be there, working through this stuff with him. There are times where it feels very sort of spiritual in a way, and at times very not. It could be anything, and so I think quite a number of people from all kinds of directions could very easily pick this up. And I've seen on booktube, it seems to, like Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse, really resonates with the work of Christian Wiman, and he is religious, and then I can see it resonating with Isaiah from that reading guy as well, and all kinds of people from different perspectives. And it's one of those books where you just sort of come at it from where you're at, and it's probably got something to say, or something that might resonate with you. So definitely give it a go. I really, really enjoyed it. And then moving on to the last book, I started it straight after finishing. Straight after finishing the history of Christianity, and I still had some hours left on Spotify, because I've got 15 hours with premium to listen to audiobooks every month. And I've been reading R.S. Thomas, his collected poems. I'm still making my way through them. And so early on, this idea turns up of the machine, and there's this poem about a guy on a tractor, and sort of how it's this moment in a community where there's no turning back. Presumably he's the first person in this rural farming community to have bought a tractor, and in many ways it's a great thing. It's a lot easier to till the earth and plough and what have you. But there's something in the poem about how he's lost the earth. He's no longer connected to the earth in the way he was before. And the machine is this thing in R.S. Thomas that sort of traps us, and disconnects us from the world. And it's certainly not an original idea. You can hear echoes of E.M. Forster and of William Blake and all kinds of other people. And so I was reading all of this stuff, and this image of the machine was becoming more and more present in his poetry, and was freaking me out more and more, mainly because although I'd never used that word, that sort of propensity in humans has been something that disturbs me, and I don't know to what extent I can talk about it, or I don't know if I've straightened it all out in my head, but it's something that certainly my dad saw and didn't like, and we talked about a lot, and so it's resulted in there being a little Luddite inside me, sort of jumping around, wanting to smash things up every now and then. And so I've got all this stuff going on in my head about the machine, about industrialization, about what we lose when we try to progress. And then I see this book come up, recommended on Spotify, called Against the Machine by Paul Kingsnorth. And it's a book about this thing. And very early on, R.S. Thomas comes up. And so I decided to just go for it, because I'm in this kind of mood where if something like that happens, if something's suggested and seems to come across at the right time, and if I still seem to be interested in it, then I'm going to try and follow it. And so I listened to it, and it was really, really fascinating. Did serve as a way to help me potentially in the future vocalize more of my fears of where humanity is going, and what we can do potentially about it, what our attitudes to technology might be, where to draw your own lines and things like that. And it turned out I already knew about this book, but kind of forgotten about it, because Drake from the channel, Orpheus, had talked about this book. I think I'd found a lot of the limitations that I'd end up agreeing with him about some of the book's limitations. And so it was just interesting that you already knew about it. But I think that there are two sort of weird points in the book. One is that Paul Kingsnorth, in the last 5 years or so, has converted to Orthodox Christianity, And so there's this whole spiritual, eschatological vision behind what's going on with the machine and with technology and where humanity's going. That's sort of taken to the level that he takes it. It very much becomes kind of tinfoil hat territory once you're there. And so that felt odd, just a little odd, and wasn't what I was expecting to be getting into with what the beginning of the book was like. But then also he was sort of saying how things like the culture war that we're apparently in at the moment is a kind of product of the machine, maybe even a distraction, a kind of entertainment of the machine, and we maybe wouldn't be thinking in the ways that we would be thinking if it wasn't for the smartphone and all of that kind of stuff, which is intriguing. And so in response, maybe the best way to go about that is to do your best to stay out of polemics and current affairs and these debates over whatever it may be, whatever cultural thing is apparently the end of the world. And the big limitation is him engaging in it. He just finds himself being sucked into it and just spends too much time talking about this. And it's certainly an area where people of both sides of the cultural left and the cultural right will find stuff quite objectionable in some of the stuff he's saying. And yeah, I just found it to be a little bit of a distraction, really, from what this machine really is. I mean, I found that initially at the beginning really, really fascinating. And it's hard to explain, hard to put into words exactly what it is. Because it's not just industrialization. And so there are loads of times where you can maybe see the machine at work, which maybe helps understand helps you understand what it is. One of the big things that happens that maybe helps you see what it is enclosure in Britain, where there was lots of land held in common, and people lived off it and grazed their animals on it. And then landowners started enclosing their land. Suddenly you've got all these brick walls separating off one person's land from another, separating who can graze their flocks on whose lands and so on. And that essentially being the thing that then drives a lot of, then once the Industrial Revolution has started up, there's loads of people who've lost their livelihood as a result of this enclosure, and so then are forced into industrial work. And sort of all of that is a kind of progression of maybe how the machine works, this mechanization of society, that it's not just the industry and the technology itself, but it's the kind of ways of thinking and managing things, and breaking things up, and things like the Enclosure Act, and things that essentially cut off your roots from where you're from, and not in a more sort of angry nationalistic kind of way, but in the kind of just communities, the sort of decent communities that we find ourselves, or that we sort of want to be a part of, and that increasingly we're living in a world that cuts us off from those kinds of communities more and more, that we maybe feel more alone, feel less ourselves, feel less human, and that what we need is maybe to draw our own lines and sort of work out how much we want this process to encroach into our own lives. I'm not explaining myself very well. Maybe it's something I'll talk about again at some other point. But all of that is to say, I find the initial history of what he calls the machine interesting. I find the end of the book where he's talking about maybe what we can do about it, and ultimately it's since the machine, it's massive, it's like a web, it has to come into each of our lives on an individual basis, and so then it's something you can deal with in a kind of human size, and so then it's maybe slightly easier when you're just looking at how this stuff affects your life to make your own changes and draw your own lines. So I found that all fascinating. It's something I'll be coming back to. But I wanted to finish the video off with essentially an author that both Christian Wiman and Paul Kingsnorth both mentioned, and both mentioned quite a lot, and really intrigued me. And that's Simone Weil, who is she was a philosopher and writer and left-wing political activist, very involved in trade unions and stuff like that. But she had a kind of spiritual side to her as well, which I think is what attracted both Kingsnorth and Christian Wiman to her writing. And it's one of those moments where something comes up, and I just feel like I have to go with it and see where it goes. So I've picked up an anthology of Simone Weil, and will at some point be making my way through it. And it actually turned out, like with Paul Kingsnorth, I actually already knew about Simone Weil and had just kind of forgotten about her. She's mentioned in the introduction to my edition of Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea, and I'd underlined her name as someone I wanted to come back to. And once I was hearing Christian Wiman and Paul Kingsnorth both talking about Simone Weil, I thought, that name rings a bell, where was it? And then I remembered about Nausea and went back to the introduction to check. So anyway, all of that is to say, I found it funny that I already knew who she was, and I'm really intrigued to get into her writing. Some of it being essays on mythology and on sociology and on theology and on politics, and I have no idea where it's going to go, but I'm enjoying following little rabbit holes that turn up. So I'll leave it there. That's sort of where my reading's at the moment. A lot of stuff that I find hard to recommend to people, but I've certainly been enjoying with where it's been going recently. If you know anything of any of these authors and have any recommendations or warnings, then please let me know. But for now, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.